Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander. So today on the show, I'm very excited to welcome back who I'd consider a friend of the show now, Jody Sutter. Jody is the owner of the Sutter Company, a business development coaching and advisory firm. She's the inventor of the Build, Win, Scale system, which is a step-by-step process designed to help leaders of small marketing agencies identify and activate their natural talents for sales and marketing, leading to a sustainable approach to winning new business. She started the Sutter Company after more than 2 decades of running business development teams for agencies, large and small, and spanning a diverse list of disciplines. They've included RGA, OMD, Havas, and the VIA agency. She's equal parts storyteller and problem solver. She knows how to prescribe the tools and techniques that are right for your agency to get your prospects to say yes. Jody frequently speaks at leading industry events around the world, such as Inbound, Traffic and Conversion, How Design Live, and others. And she is the author of a book, which we will talk about, which is A Small Agency's Guide to Winning New Business, 8 Steps to Winning More of the Right Kinds of Clients, which you can snag on Amazon. So, Jody, great to have you back on the show. My first question is, how would you describe a culture of new business?
Yeah, a culture of new business. First of all, it's not the easiest thing to describe. I think agencies often believe that they have a culture of new business, or they ascribe what I think are maybe not always the right things. I think, first of all, for agencies that I tend to work with, like you, Dan, I tend to work with smaller agencies, and they are agencies that tend also not to have a dedicated business development resource. And so I believe that the culture has to start from the top. It has to start with the owner or the co-founders or the CEO, whatever the title is. Because without that, then there is no culture. So that is sort of the underlying thread, but also like it's the thing that holds it all together. And I think sometimes owners, co-founders, CEOs, they hesitate to take on the role because they don't want to feel saddled with business development. And so I always look at it by saying, well, look, you're going to be the one ultimately responsible for bringing the revenue as the owner. So let's find a way that, an approach to business development that fits well with that person's strengths and the existing resources. So that's the first way to do it. And yeah, the culture really starts with the owner or co-founders having a level of involvement that guides the agency, and they are the decision makers. I always say business development is not a democracy. Certainly you want to take everyone's beliefs and opinions into account, but you've got to have a decider at the top.
Yeah, I really like that perspective. And I think that like a lot of the times agencies and everybody will run away from tension, right? Because it's like, well, there's tension. We want this client's fulfillment team doesn't, or whatever. And that's not bad. Like there should be some amount of tension, and not every side should be happy with every client that gets taken on at every time. Otherwise, if fulfillment only got their way, there wouldn't be enough growth and there wouldn't be enough innovation. And vice versa, if the salespeople, agency owners only got their way, there'd be a lot of unhappy clients.
That's right.
So to dig into that a little bit more, make it more tangible, what does a day in the life look like for the agency that has a strong business development culture versus one that doesn't?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I don't know if I've ever been asked that question. I kind of love that. I'm going to give you hopefully a very high quality answer here, but I think it's a question I'm going to take away and noodle a bit on. What is a day? Or maybe it's even better to look at what does a week look like? Oh gosh, I'm even going to roll it back. I think in some ways, as I think about this, it actually has to be a broader perspective. What does the year to 3 years look like? So I think you sort of start with that. Here's where we are today. Here's where we want to be a year or 3 years from now. Here's what our promises are, the basic foundational stuff. Here's what we promise to our clients. Here's who our clients are. Then you look at your team. Here's who our team is. Here's what we're good at. And here's how we can apply our strengths to getting where we need to go. Okay. So once that's figured out, and this is really what I call defining your new business ecosystem. So I guess just to give you maybe a broad example, you might be an agency owner listening to this, and you might be saying to yourself, like, I'm listening to Dan's podcast all the time, and you know what? I really hate business development. The last thing I want to do is go out and send a bunch more cold emails, which, by the way, if they work with you, they're not sending cold emails, they're sending high quality emails, but it just doesn't feel right to them. So what I might say to them is like, okay, well, look, you might intellectually understand that kind of outbound outreach can be very effective, but you're not going to do it because it makes you feel uncomfortable. So what does make you comfortable? What are you more excited about? Maybe it's writing a book. Maybe it is taking some of the strong opinions they have about the work that they do and turning it into more of a speaker strategy. Once we can define that, now we can build a plan around it. And now also you can bring other people in with complementary strengths so that we can start to turn that approach into a lead generating strategy. And I think in the long term, the most successful business development program is the one that gets done. So that ideally is setting things up, setting that agency up to actually do the work. So now once that broader plan is there, I actually really like working in 12-week sprints. So then we can look at that and say, okay, if our goal is to bring in 25% more revenue, and we're going to do this by getting the CEO out there and getting her on the speaker circuit, talking about Gen Z buying habits, we're going to get her in all those areas where the ideal clients are. Now we can look at, say, okay, between now and the next 12 weeks, in order to do that, we've got to, if you're starting that strategy, well, you got to put together her speaker kit, number one. So sometimes it's a lot of unsexy tactical stuff, which nothing's going to happen. So we look at that and we look at what are our goals? What's going to move the needle between now and the next 12 weeks? And then we can work into weekly and daily schedules. So I'm a big proponent of, what's that phrase? Eating the elephant one bite at a time. Yeah. I think that's the way I think once you take action, then you're going to start to see the results.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll often make kind of goofy metaphors to fitness and stuff where it's like people will ask like, hey, when should we do a prospecting campaign? And I was like, that's like asking, when should you start working out and eating healthy? Like, when are you willing to do it? But I think you hit on something interesting, which is like the right business development program is one that actually gets done and gets done sustainably and repeatedly. So I guess my question is, how do you decide which strategy is right for you as an agency owner? How are you kind of working through that to determine which one of these things are you going to do every day, more or less, for the next 6, 12 months, whatever it is?
Yeah. I think there are a couple of different approaches. One is that strengths approach. So for instance, if you are that type of agency leader who is opinionated and loves getting in front of an audience, in general, I find those people, and I typify those people as communicators. I have 4 new business personality roles: the communicator, the promoter, the connector, and the thinker. So the communicator role is often they're from more of a strategy background. Like I said, they really love thinking about taking complex ideas and making them easy to understand. They enjoy sharing their ideas, and they are often better one to many or one to few. They're probably better in a presentation room than they are, say, in a networking event. Sometimes, and again, this is, pardon my generalization, but a lot of times these folks are not always that detail oriented. And also because they know that their ideas and their sort of conceptual thinking is valuable, they're not always, they can be a little bit arrogant. So not always great to get in a one-to-one conversation. So that's the first thing I look like, is what are those strengths? The other thing that I will also look like, because sometimes the agency may not even be ready to embrace a big approach, a big strategic direction like that. So I often look at, like, what are the things that an agency has sort of no excuse not to do? And even for those hesitant agency owners, what can we do? A lot of times it's around working your existing network. I'm sure you've had lots of your clients say, like, we've tapped into our network. Like we've tried referrals, we've tried working our network, we're done. And I hear that a lot, but I don't think I've ever actually seen that truly happening. I think in general, they think they've tapped into their network, or they think they've tapped out their network, but they haven't. Maybe they've put a couple of requests out, but they haven't done it strategically. So I think there's a lot there. Referrals, strategic partnerships, I think, can be a really wonderful way for agencies to sort of power the flywheel and sell in a relatively non-threatening way, because you're working through a strategic partner or a service provider that provides complementary services. So you're sort of building the team. You help them, they help you. So I think that there are some ways that are a little bit easier. You can ease an agency owner into a business development approach rather than just dumping them out there and say, build a list, or dumping them out there and say, go speak on a stage.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of it, as with everything, is just kind of like what is the thing you're actually optimizing for and what are you expecting out of a
Yeah.
particular approach. So what does that mean? I think that if an agency owner is used to referrals and going right into proposal mode pretty often,
hmm
the reframe is thinking about, I'm actually going for a different sort of win with this approach, whether it's speaking or whether it's outreach like with us or whatever it is, where it's like, I'm trying to open up new relationships. I'm trying to get to this other conversion point that has nothing to do with the thing that I've done for the last 10 years, right?
Yes.
And I found that the best clients we've worked with are the ones that are thinking of outreach in our case or whatever, or it could be something else in somebody else's case, as developing a new skill set as
Yeah.
opposed to trying to drum up 3 new clients in 6 months, right? Which is never happens.
Right. That is both the better way to do it. And yet you and I can talk about that day and night. No, we're never going to get tired of it. And there's always going to be something to say about it. But it really takes that agency owner who realizes that, and sometimes it's the ones that have tried numerous times to get those 3 new clients in 6 months. And it's when they realize, this hasn't worked. It may never work. So I have to take a big step back and figure out like, what am I doing wrong? I've also been seeing, a lot of times it's not about scrapping everything that they've been doing. It's more about going in and understanding which levers to pull a little bit more aggressively or with more finesse.
Yeah, exactly. Like I had a conversation today with an agency that was interested in doing outreach to e-commerce organizations, and they tried to do cold outreach for years and nothing worked to get these doors open with like e-commerce founders and stuff. But the one thing they said was working was partnerships, because they would partner with agencies that didn't do what they do to get referred. Yeah. So my question is like, well, we could, maybe we could get you in with e-commerce companies. We've done that a lot, but you've tried it and it hasn't worked. Like, have you really exploited all the opportunity with partnerships? Is that all completely done with? And then as we dug into it, it was like, no, you've barely scratched the surface of the thing that is working. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But that takes more patience, and we all have a bit of like neophilia, which is going for the new thing, right? So yeah, that all makes sense. I love these archetypes that you've laid out. So communicator, we talked about that. That's somebody that is interested in complexity, kind of does better on a stage. What about the promoter? Who's that person?
So the promoter does have some communicator qualities, and the promoter happens to be the only one that I've actually got a real live person as kind of the avatar. And I use Gary Vaynerchuk. Gary Vaynerchuk, I think, is the prototypical promoter, because he is, I think the hallmarks of a promoter are is a person whose business life bleeds into their personal life bleeds into their business. They've got something to say. They're not afraid to say it. They're obviously the biggest boosters for themselves and their agency. Unlike a communicator, when a communicator is more about a polarizing idea or a different way of looking at something, which grabs the attention of a prospect. The promoter is more about harnessing that raw energy. You've probably seen Gary Vaynerchuk speak, whether it's on a recording on YouTube or live. He is generous with his information. He is a ball of energy. I don't think he's that great a speaker, though. He's great because of the energetic style and the amount of information he provides. But he's not like that traditional speaker. So, and he is also really willing to go out there and maybe expose himself a little bit in ways that might make other people comfortable. Now, the thing is, a lot of times, if you can't harness that energy, if you are a promoter or your agency's run by a promoter, then the trick is to figure out okay, how do we take that and how do we then convert that into leads? And so Gary Vaynerchuk is a great model because he is on every platform, and it's not always about even his videos, it's always about converting. It's about generosity. And yet, after a while, you really want to work with this guy because he's if he's this good, if he's this generous with the general public, what's he going to be like with his clients?
Right.
So he's a great example of a promoter.
Yeah, I love that. It's almost like it's not that they have amazing original ideas, but they're very good. Almost like how copper transfers electricity, they transfer emotion.
I love that. Yeah.
So that's cool. And then let's talk about connectors. Who are they?
So the connectors are probably the people who are best qualified or best or naturally inclined to being that sort of salesperson, networker. I describe a typical connector as being that person. By the way, this is not me, but I've known them. That person who steps onto a flight going from New York to Los Angeles and walks off with not only a business card from the random person they sat next to, but a business opportunity. So they naturally can create connections in a one-to-one kind of way. One of my first clients, he runs a small agency in Atlanta. He's a true connector. He's great walking into a room, a networking room, a cocktail party. He's particularly good at making people feel comfortable and at ease with himself. And I don't think he's even trying, but he's so good at ferreting out opportunities through these conversations. Not everyone is good at that. Now, the other thing that this connector client of mine is terrible at is thought leadership. That's a communicator. I have tried so many times in the past to encourage him to put his thoughts down, to write content, to get expert content in the world. He won't do it. He hates it. He finds it difficult because he likes going into a networking room so much better. So let him do that and abandon that thought leadership strategy, or maybe don't abandon it yet. Put it on the sidelines, build up your connector-led strategy. Let him or her build the pipeline, support them by managing the CRM well, getting them into the right spaces, making sure that they follow up. The other thing that connectors also are not so, or one of their foibles is they tend to be people pleasing. So they're not always great closers because they also are probably the types of people who will say yes to the client, will reduce price or increase scope without increasing price because they just want to please the client.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it kind of ties into books like The Challenger Sale, where it's like the salespeople are like, they're poking a little bit and pushing and walking away and so on. So that makes sense. And I like that this is a little more nuanced than just introvert, extrovert, because I'm curious what you think. I'd probably put myself more in the communicator box.
Me too.
But I'm also not an introvert. I think when I've taken all the Myers-Briggs and all that stuff and just knowing myself for however many years, I feel more like an extrovert. So that's interesting. Then finally, thinkers. Let's talk about them.
Yeah, well, they are the ones that tend to be a little more introverted. A lot of agency owners, this is something that I was not necessarily expecting when I started to use these prototypes. A lot of agency owners are thinkers. I think partly that has to do with agency owners who started out as creatives. There are a lot of creatives, a lot of art directors, or agency owners with art direction background who are, they do their best work when they're drawing energy from themselves rather than their outer environment. So the thinker in some ways is challenging, but what I also find is that thinkers can also be really good in a one-to-one setting. So they may not be great walking into a networking cocktail party, but they can be really good in a one-to-one sales meeting. Where they really need to feel comfortable, though, is with the message. Like, why am I there? What's the purpose? They're not good bullshitters. So they are really well served by a strong elevator pitch and a strong messaging strategy, a strong client-focused messaging strategy. And so when we can get them, sometimes if they're a lot of agencies, as you know, are very focused on here's what we do and here's what we can do for you, as opposed to, hey, client, these are the struggles we know that you're going through. Then you provide the solution. So I think if they can feel like they have a strong message, then they can be excellent business developers in a one-to-one setting.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think that the thinkers, as you describe them, that I think we've encountered are the ones that they have to go on the biggest journey to come around to developing this business development mindset. Or else they just kind of stay stuck in place.
Some thinkers also, if they've got some communicator in them, then maybe they need to be writing a book, or maybe they need to be fielding a research study, some sort of lead generating content. And I know it takes a long time to write a book, but you might as well spend the next year doing that rather than spend the next year doing everything that you've always been doing, which just never generates enough leads.
Right. And I think you're kind of hitting on this idea that like all of this stuff is hard and takes time. So you have to pick the one that you can have the most fun with.
Yes.
Or maybe more than one eventually. So that all makes sense. So to shift gears a little bit, you have this concept in your book called staring down fear. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, part of me wonders if I'm even fully qualified to talk about it. But I do think that sales is, I think, the root of the hesitancy, embracing sales, especially more of an outbound oriented strategy is this fear of rejection. And I think there's the more obvious fear of rejection, which is, well, I'm going to send out 25 emails and I heard nothing back. Like everyone hates me, which of course is not the case. So there's a certain amount of psychological buildup that you can do to counteract that. And again, I think this is also where a strong elevator pitch, a strong client-focused messaging strategy can work. Because if you go out there as an agency and say, hey, I'm trying to think of like all the terrible jargony stuff that you and I always see, like full service, fully integrated, creative powerhouse, digital first, relentlessly pursuing results. Would you like a meeting? That's not going to that feels enthusiastic and generous, but it's just going to bounce off that prospect. There's nothing for them to hook into. But if you can turn that around and say, like, look, here's the thing. We work with large scale manufacturers, and we know that from our experience, we know that one of your biggest issues is a successful marketing campaign that is going to reach distributors. I'm making this up. I have no idea if that's the case. And we have found ways to get their attention. Would you like to hear more? And what I say is like, look, you may still be rejected, but the fact is you're speaking from your experience about what their issues are. So you're making an assumption they've got this problem. Right. But the assumption is grounded in reality, grounded in your experience. And so if you're rejected in the form of no answer or no thank you, not right now, that's okay. You move on to the next one. Like you should, as the agency, you should feel secure that you understand this because you solved this problem. So I think that's one way to stare down fear. I think there are sort of three other fears that I talk about in the book, and that's mostly due to the investment of time and energy and maybe money in doing something that you're not certain about, and will it work or will it not work? And sort of like, is it fear of paying off, fear of going down that route and realizing that nothing happened? And I can't remember what the third one is, but sort of that sense of like, well, I'm paralyzed by my own uncertainty. Yeah. So I'm just going to stay in one spot.
Yeah. I've always said this, like, I think what's interesting is a lot of agencies, let's say they're in the media business and they're looking at the meters on places like Facebook and they're seeing the conversion rates go up and down and left and right, and they're just emotionally detached from it. It doesn't really mean that much. A sales funnel behaves the same way, but the difference is you're in it and you're a person and you have emotions, but it's the same thing, more or less. You're still looking at the same percentages and so on.
I have one client, they're a small digital agency in New York City, and the president who I've been working now with for a bunch of years, he really he can let his emotions get the better of him. And more than once, many times, he said, like, well, I had a meeting with them and then I tried to follow up and they never heard back from me. So clearly they're not interested in us. So clearly they are rejecting us despite the fact that we invested our time in. And so I guess maybe I'm also the eternal optimist, but I think like, look, if you're going to generate revenue and opportunities for your agency, you just can't think about it that way. And you have to look at that person who has quote unquote rejected you and realize they're a human being with a ton of other pressures in their own job. Like, you don't know, maybe they're not getting back to you because they know that if they don't bring up other performance metrics, that they're going to get fired in a month. And so they just quite frankly are not thinking about an opportunity with your agency. Just like, let it be. It's okay. Move on to the next one. And I think empathy and generosity can be your friend rather than feeling hurt feelings.
Yeah, I think the other thing at work, and this is me projecting because maybe I feel this more myself, is the times where I've been most frustrated with deals that have gotten close to the finish line and then somebody ghosts me and it's just a big waste of time and energy and everything like that. Half of it's because I'm frustrated at myself and for having a process that wasn't dialed in enough of that in that moment, right? Whenever, even if things don't work out, if I'm like, oh, I did everything as well as what I could and I abided by the process that we set, it's like, that's fine. But also when you abide by the process that you set, you end up respecting your own time more and not bending your own rules for people and that sort of thing.
So I'm curious, when you talk about not abiding by your own process, is that also would be things like, another mistake I see a lot is things like putting too much work into a proposal that is more information than the client needs at that stage, lobbing that proposal over to them as an attachment to an email, and then hoping you hear back from them, rather than having a conversation. What does this client need in order to get us to the next point? Making sure that's that's kind of all you're giving them. Like, you need to know what our process is. Great. Let's talk about our process. I'm not going to bog you down with 5,000 case studies. I'm just going to give you my process. And also trying to replace some of those email documents and attachments with conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And basically, I mean, I think a lot of it is once you've gone through enough reps of this, you develop a sixth sense, you develop a gut feeling for what's going to work out and what's not. And then being able to listen to that signal and then go for the no sooner with people.
Yeah.
It'll either tell you things you didn't know or save your time.
Right. Right.
Which is important. I think this is all kind of tied to the emotional side of sales, which I think is big now. I think I'm curious to hear what you're seeing with your clients, but there's some slowdown. There's a lot of dirt in the gears or whatever. Things don't seem to be moving as forward for lots of agencies that we talk to. When you have clients or yourself that are kind of in this rut, like emotionally, what are your recommendations for getting them out of it and getting like excited again and out of the slump?
I wish I had a silver bullet, because I don't. But something, and I've been thinking about this a lot. So I've been lucky. There have been a handful of clients that I'm working with right now who are actually doing pretty well. And if I had to think about it, probably those are the ones who have a defined niche. I mean, I'm thinking one in particular, they're quite strong in healthcare, and their vulnerable area is that they've only got a few of quite large clients. But they're actually getting better at growing lines of business within those large clients. So they're staying quite busy because the healthcare category is a vibrant, robust category. But for others, I got an email the other day from a client I worked with this time last year, and they're doing everything right, but they're in high tech and they're just not seeing the traction. They're putting out some proposals and they're just not seeing the traction. I'm not sure why that is. I'm going to be having, you're going to be on my LinkedIn Live. I don't know, maybe by the time people listen to this podcast, you'll already be on there. So maybe we'll be talking about this then too. But I'm going to be having Russell Woolworth in November of 2024. If this comes out before that. And he's an agency search consultant. And that's really, I'm going to be peppering him with questions about that, because he works with those marketers. He's asking them what's going on, why they are not high, like what's slowing them down, what are the big obstacles that they need to solve in order to perform well. I think sometimes I also want my clients to focus on how can you get a quicker win, maybe carve out a smaller project that you can start with a client, and so they feel like they're not on the hook for a larger price tag. I'm curious what some of the things that you're advising your clients too.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is there's no bad or good time to start building relationships with people that you can help, regardless of interest rates up, down, people supposedly buying or not buying, although I think people make assumptions about that. So a lot of it is, again, kind of back to building systems, building skill sets, and kind of owning this process. Yeah.
And I guess is also where some of the fear, anxiety comes in, and where you have to let that go, because as I think you were alluding to right there, is the value of consistency and a little bit like, pray and move your feet. We are in a cyclical business. And so I think the danger is getting freaked out in a dip, in a low part of the cycle, stopping what you're doing. And then when it starts coming back again, you may not be there to ride the wave in the same way you would if you kept going.
Yeah. And I think talking about dips and these sort of like changes and fluctuations and stuff, I think what I've found is that, like, for us, and then probably our better clients too, that are probably even more sophisticated at this than we are, your own internal metrics and your numbers kind of become like a warm blanket that like protects you from the cold a little bit. Yeah. Because then you don't go crazy, because then you can look back and say, like, well, we usually have fewer leads in June and we changed this thing over here and that affected this. But if it's all just, my old client Bob's friend straggled through the other day through referral, and that happens maybe once a month, then it's all just macro, the sky is falling. Oh, interest rates went down. That's why my friend's friend Bob didn't come through,
I also think that there's always something else that's probably on your to-do list, or your big to-do list. And I think what we also are not always good at doing is that when we are in these dips, we panic, but instead of panicking, maybe take a look at things like all you thinkers out there, maybe saying, you know what, we're in a dip. I now have a little bit more time in my day, so I'm going to pick up that book writing project again. and start to incorporate some hours into my schedule because I may not have them in 2 months. And then you're still moving forward in it's a longer term initiative, but I think actions are rewarded.
Yeah, totally. Shifting gears a little bit, I think a lot of agency owners, understandably want to get out of the sales seat, both to build enterprise value, also to have nice lives, open up time. What have you seen, between your clients that have been able to do this successfully and the ones that haven't? What makes them different?
So again, going back to what we started talking about, I think there's a few things. But if the business development strategy, it has been set by the owner, by the top leadership, based on their strengths and based on their vision, then it sort of sounds almost paradoxical, but then the more likely it is that that agency owner is going to be able to identify where the gaps are and fill those gaps with others on the team. I also think it's a bit of a function of size. What I found is that for any agency that is below 40 people, it's much more challenging to maintain an in-house business development person, full-time business development person. Either you're got someone more junior, so you had spend a lot of time with them, or you've got someone really senior and quite frankly can't afford them and they're not showing the results because it takes time. But you also, they're not bringing in the results soon enough to justify the cost. So when you are below, I guess probably below 10 employees, that I think you're focused mostly on the fastest way from point A to point B. So that might be those things that agency owners have no excuse doing: strategic partnerships, referrals, working their network. And then as you grow and you have more people who can help support you, that also then starts to open the door for leveraging your strengths. So you realize, I'm a communicator. I've done well. I've grown our agency. I've got a pipeline because I've been really strong with my referral strategy. But now we need to do something else. So, okay, I'm going to assign Dan over there to handle the referral strategy because I've set up a system. And so now he can handle that. And I'm going to start building my communicator strategy. And maybe I'll have Annie over there help me put together the speaker kit, put together a list of events where I should be. And then as you grow, again, you can start building that team to help supporting you and all the things that you aren't so good at so that you can focus on what you are really good at. And then once you get to that 40, 50 or more, then you can start saying, okay, now I can actually start building a business development and marketing team.
Yeah, that's cool. And I agree with most of that. I think the one nuance I'd probably say is that it might be less. I think the headcount might correlate with that pretty well, but I think it might be able to happen sooner from what we've seen. Like when the agency basically has systems, they have a car in order to put a driver into, is what we've seen.
That's a really good point. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It's certainly exceptions to, well, maybe. Yeah, I have seen other exceptions to my own rule. We actually have a shared client it's a company of one, and he's actually hired. It's an outsourced salesperson, but he's doing it. So yeah, I think that there's certainly lots of variations there, but in general, I think the smaller you are, the more the owner has to be involved. But there are ways that I don't think the owner ever has to be the only business development resource.
Correct. And it also could be that 10 employees, it might not be literally true 100% of the time, but it's useful enough because it's it's useful knowledge, because if you have 10, chances are you have the resources to stick it out and build the systems for the salesperson and so on.
It also depends on the type of agency you are. If you've got something that's a little bit more, say, performance marketing driven, then maybe you're a 10-person agency and 2 of them are salespeople because you have such a potent an attractive sales proposition that it makes sense to have people out there getting the word out. If you're more of a brand strategy or integrated 30-person agency, integrated agency, more bespoke solutions, then maybe that's where I think the owner is able to kind of leverage their role as the head of the agency to create relationships that will ideally convert to clients.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's do a sidebar on creds decks and the like, and another collateral just to spice things up. So, how much do creds decks matter? And if they do matter, how do you build a good one?
I've built a lot of creds decks in my life, and I will admit that it wasn't actually until I started running this company, working for myself, that I realized how badly creds decks are used. I had kind of an epiphany where I realized that, agencies tend to use them as a marketing tool, and they're not a marketing tool. Marketing and sales, I guess. But how many times have you heard an agency saying, well, I'm going to introduce myself to that client. I'm going to attach my creds deck, or they sounded interested in us. They said, just send your creds deck, like before any conversations were had. I think that is a client saying, we're actually not that interested, but we will satisfy you by saying that we want to see your creds deck, send it on over so we can receive it and then put it in the trash. So I think a credentials deck, that sort of fairly typical 10 to 15 slide deck that says here, who our clients are, here's what our process is. Here are a few case studies. Here's where we're located. Here's who the team is. I think it's an excellent post-rationalization tool. So it is a great tool for either confirming a hunch early on in the sales process of a client who maybe runs into some good work that you've done or sees an interesting article that you either written or quoted in. And so they need to go and just make sure that, like, is this person legit? Is this agency legit? Then it's also useful towards the end of the sales process where you've gone through meetings, you've submitted a proposal. Maybe you're going into your final presentation where there may be a few new personalities in the room who need to rubber stamp you so that you can move forward. That's also where your point of contact needs to say to their boss, their board members, their stakeholders, look, this agency they've got all these people. They're located in a major city. They've got all these clients. They have this type of approach. It's a post-rationalization tool. So it's also not a self-guided tour. I think that's another mistake. A lot of again, lobbing over as an attachment to an email, like the client will figure it out. And they won't, because they're never going to bring it to life the way you can. I also think your website is an excellent credentials tool, and most agencies don't rely on that. I don't know why most agencies don't say, hey, I appreciate you wanting to see our credentials deck, but if you head to this URL, you'll find our agency, and basically you'll find everything you need to know about us right there. So, yeah.
I think what we've seen from lots of our clients is that a lot of the times there's this thing where it's like, we're trying to get people to do the thing that we ultimately want. Like we want them to buy from us. But that's not what any of this stuff is doing. All the thing is supposed to do is get the person to the next thing, right? So a creds deck, what's the action you want somebody to take after a creds deck? It's actually not buying from you. It's actually having a conversation with you.
That's right.
Right. So I think that the ideal creds deck is kind of doing what any other lead gen funnel is doing, but it's selling that conversation probably, right? And getting just enough information to lead to that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think also it's, again, that's that typical 10 to 15 slide with the requisite sections. You are making assumptions about what the client wants to hear. You're making assumptions about what they don't know about you. And it's always unuseful to make assumptions. Much better to have a conversation and find out, what they need to know to advance the sale.
Yeah. We just have a few minutes left. I think one thing I'd love to dig into real quick, and it might be too big of a topic to get through, is let's say that like you're working with a client and they have those building blocks in place to hire that new business person and they want them to be successful. What does that typical trading cadence look like?
I think it's probably more guidelines than not. Number one, I think don't expect your business development person to define your strategy. I think you need to define your overall strategy for growth, and then ask your business development person to work within that strategy. They need to come up with their own plan, but it's got to ladder up to a strategy that you develop. Smart communication. Don't send them out into the woods with a compass and a granola bar. Have regular communication, have clear expectations. I think there's not, especially if you are hiring someone who's a little more junior, maybe senior as well. I think there's not enough mentorship or there's not enough guidance. I really wish that agency owners would allow their business development person to just do like ride-alongs more often. Allow them into your Rolodex, to use an outdated term. Welcome them into some of those pre-existing relationships of people, those referrers, those low-hanging fruit network, so that they can get some quick wins, so that they can then help you grow those relationships. Don't be too sort of proprietary or protective over that. So it's more about not dumping the responsibility on this poor, unassuming soul, or it's not about that. It's more about sort of guiding them in and having a bit of a transition time and working with them on the strategy.
Yeah. And I think you hit on something that we talk about a lot, which is that, and I've probably made versions of this mistake myself early in the business, which is sort of like asking the salesperson to answer questions that are very entrepreneurial, that is like very,
Yes.
very far above their pay grade, such as who am I contacting? Who are we selling to?
Right.
That's not a salesperson question to answer. Yeah.
Yeah. The conversation would be more productive if it went something like, hey, we work with Fortune 100 manufacturing companies, and we tend to work, our clients tend to be CIOs. And they find us valuable because for these three reasons. Now the salesperson can say, all right, well, now I know how to build this list. And I know a sort of a core messaging strategy that I can use to get their attention. And then I think also iteration too. It's like, okay, well, here's the list. Here's how I'm going to be talking to them. Does that feel right? How should I evolve it? And then also, how can you support that person once they do have the list? This idea of taking responsibility for ensuring that they always have a message to get out there. So remember, most of these people are probably good connectors, which means they are probably not strong thought leaders. They're really good at follow through. They're really good on that one-to-one conversation, but you need to equip them with the story so they can tell it over time in those different chapters.
Exactly. And what we found is that good salespeople are successful within an existing system times out of 10. So if you're looking for that person, their track record is built from being in a system where they're probably getting leads or at least getting supported and have a lot of that guidance and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
They're also going to sell themselves really well, in that conversation. So
yeah.
that can work once you have those building blocks in place. So Jody, this is, as usual, this was amazing. I guess getting towards the end of our time, what are you working on over the next few months at Sutter Company, and how can people learn more?
Well, I think one of the things that's going to be happening by the time this podcast comes out is I will be we're coming up towards the end of 2024. And in December, I'm going to be offering once again my new business blueprint. It's an annual planning masterclass. So it's 3 sessions plus pre-recorded curriculum to help agency owners write their annual plan for business development, their strategic plan for the sales and marketing activities that they are going to undertake in 2025. What I've found is, through my own experience, as well as working with lots of different agency owners, is that we tend to make it way too complicated. We also tend to reassure ourselves in the act of planning. We convince ourselves that we're doing something when we're actually just pushing a lot of paperwork around. So I've got a really simple 3-page new business plan. We do various exercises to pull together the information that can fill that business plan, and then set people up so that starting January, they are moving into their first sprint. They've got their goals, they've got their team, and they're doing as much as they're planning, or maybe more so. So that's coming up, and I will be happy to provide a URL where people can sign up for that. And also anytime that the people are listening to this and they want to learn more about what I do or just have a question for me, I'm happy to have conversations. They can email me, and I'll also include my calendar link. Anyone who wants a free 45-minute exploratory call is more than welcome.
That sounds great, Jody. We'll get all that linked up, and it's always nice to have a plan. So that sounds great. Thanks again, Leah. Let's do another one before long.
Thank you, Dan. This was a real pleasure.